I lose my shit if my PNL goes awry in a month. Every single month, my PNL has to be in black. That kind of a sort of a paranoia, of course, it comes with a trade off of scale. But over a period of time, I've also realized that there is only so much that you can scale or grow that the market naturally allows you. Everything else is essentially sort of buying with the hope that the market would eventually reach there. Probably one out of 100 times you get lucky, but 99 times you don't.
Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Cariappa. Milaap is India's largest crowdfunding platform, having raised over 2,000 crores in the last decade. In this conversation, I speak to Anoj Vishwanathan, the co-founder and president of Milaap, about how he set out to build and scale giving as a category. We speak about some of the nuances of managing a two-sided marketplace, dealing with policy and regulation, and building a trusted community. This was a fascinating chat about a rather unique business. I'm sure you'll like it. So let's check out this episode with Anoj Vishwanathan. Hey Anoj, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Hey, thanks Roshan for having me here. Good to be here.
Yeah, we've been trying to connect for a while. I'm so glad that this finally happened. Anuj, you started Milaap almost, I think, 12, 13 years back, right? And that was a very different time. Crowdfunding as a concept itself was quite new at that time. Whereas today, I mean, I think, people's attitudes have matured. It's a viable path for people to donate and for people to engage in charitable causes and so on and so forth. If you can just take us through, how things have evolved in that 10, 12 years from a landscape perspective, and also talk about the various stakeholders and so on in this domain, basically.
Yeah, we started just when the last recession happened, right? So it was almost like 2009. So we're talking about 13 years per se. Now, if I were to sort of, looking back, if categorize how crowdfunding has evolved, I would probably do it in like sort of three phases, I would say. The first phase is essentially between 2010 to 2016. This was the time when crowdfunding, we were essentially inspired because by saying that, hey, giving is a everyday behavior, everyday consumer behavior, whether people realize it or not. It is a behavior. We do it all the time, right? How do we bring this online in a way that's transparent, engaging, and so on? Right. So the first sort of 4 5 years, essentially, it mimicked the broader consumer internet adoption in the sense that people who were sort of coming onto the platform were people who were comfortable making transactions online. They've purchased something online and so on, right? They've shopped online, they've booked tickets and so on and so forth, right? And that was a sort of a very slow, sort of a grinding phase, if I were to put it that way, because unlike other sort of products or services, you're not selling anything tangible, right? You are
Yeah,
essentially sort of providing something that's intangible, which is essentially the opportunity to support someone in need, and correspondingly the sort of happiness, satisfaction that you get out of it, and so on, right? Whatever the motivations are. So the primary piece here essentially then becomes the feedback loop for your product, unlike a commerce product where you order something online. In 7 days you get to know whether the product comes to you, whether it works the way it was envisioned to be, and so on and so forth. Whereas when it comes to something like giving, intangible, we very quickly realize that, hey, the intangible here is essentially trust, because trust is what drives people to come and sort of contribute, so to say. So building that trust over that period of time was probably sort of the grinding phase, I would say. In fact, today we have sort of channeled close to 2,000 crores in donations over the last 12, 13 years. It took us almost 7 years to do the first 100 crores. So that's the sort of the growth per se. And the second phase was from 2017 to 2019-20, that I would say. It was essentially when mobile adoption, be it data and then be it UPI and mobile payments, sort of became ubiquitous. Right now, you're no longer sort of constrained by the size of the giving, the size of the transactions. Anybody could possibly give, irrespective of where they are, and so on and so forth, right? So
right.
what was originally a phenomenon that was just limited to, let's say, metros and diaspora communities quickly started becoming more into tier 2, tier 3, not just from a giving perspective but also from raising money perspective, right? So that
Right.
that phase was when we saw really our penetration or adoption in smaller towns and cities, like let's say a Salem or Dispur or and Dehradun and Rourkela and so on and so forth. And the third phase was essentially, when COVID struck, which was when it sort of got into sort of mainstream attention, if I may put it that way, which was, yes, people knew about crowdfunding, but it was more of something that, they think about it on the side and so on. It wasn't something that, was considered or thought about as a utility, or something that has a utilitarian effect, if I put it that way, right? Especially the second wave of COVID was a scenario where people realized that, hey, I mean, there are so many safety nets, especially when it comes to healthcare and so on. But when all of those sort of break, crowdfunding also sort of works as a temporary safety net for certain segments of the population. Some of them would have otherwise also or continue to sort of be donors per se. So I think that's essential. And now we are in the post pandemic sort of era where it is now mainstream. Now people understand how it works, the
Hmm.
pros and the cons and the areas of improvement and so on and so forth. So it's, the way forward is going to be a lot more sort of very deliberate and focused in terms of how users want this to be shaped.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting sort of an evolution. And what you mentioned in terms of a safety net is such an important thing, right? I mean, especially during COVID, I mean, we saw people come together and really help everyone around. So, yeah, I mean, that was really inspiring. Take us back to the founding story of Milap. I know you've spoken about it a couple of times, but, going from idea to company seems a bit of a challenge for more than a couple of reasons, right? So, one is that I think Milap is a classic two-sided marketplace, right? I mean, you have lenders on one side and you have people who list causes on the other, and one will not happen without the other, right? So that is one thing. And second, also it's extremely regulated, right? This entire thing, right? You call it P2P lending or whatever else is extremely regulated, and this regulation and changes as well, right? And so I mean, when I look at those challenges, how do you get started? How do you just acquire the first few customers, and how do you get started with this?
Yeah, so I think the way Milap is today is an evolution from how we started, right? So when we started in 2010 technically, but yeah, the genesis of the idea was from 2009. So the background story to that was, so I was studying in Singapore and was about to graduate and was hoping to sort of get into an investment banking job and be settled for life, right? And then the recession happened, right? So, and all of a sudden I realized that, okay, I have to look out somewhere else for opportunities. And that's how I came back to India in late 2008 and ended up working with microfinance institution, so to speak. So, for people who are not aware of what microfinance is, it's about providing small amounts of capital, mostly in the form of loans, which do not have a collateral per se, but it is essentially meant as a social sort of collateral where people sort of vouch for each other and take a loan, and then they vouch for repayments and so on. So that was very sort of fascinating for me, and that's where I met my co-founder who also sort of worked in the same space. And three things stood out for us very clearly. I spent around 15 to 18 months in that the organization and in the space, and what I realized was, one, how small amounts of capital can have tremendous impact in the lives of individual families per se, right? We are talking about 2000 rupees, 5000 rupees and so on, which was considered like a pretty big sum for somebody to sort of move into subsistence, or even in some cases even sort of move to the next level, so to speak. That was fascinating. The second one was how, despite the fact that it had tremendous impact, a vast majority of people still did not have access to that. While it was growing and it was becoming more mainstream, given the size of India and the sort of inclusion, and we are now talking about 2008, 2009, right? We have come a
Right.
long way in financial inclusion and so on. But 10, 12 years ago, it was still a major challenge per se to even get a bank account. And the third essentially was how the risk return profile of capital varied when it came to how an individual perceived versus how a institution perceived, right? So
Right.
I saw this and I came back to Singapore for one of my trips, and I met a couple of my friends from college, and they were all in investment banking and so on. And one of them told me this. He said, look, from an individual perspective, this is probably the best ROI and the best investment that I could make. Making, a small 100, $250, $500 investment, call it whatever you want to call it a loan, call it a charity, but this is probably the best, investment that I could make. But when it comes to, making it with an institution, then immediately you sort of bring in all these parameters around past credit history, data, collateral, appetite for risk, and so on and so forth. So that's when the idea of crowdfunding sort of stuck, because it was just coming into sort of mainstream attention, especially in the US, right? So, companies like Kickstarter were just coming up, Kiva was coming up, and so on and so forth, 3 4 years into it. And then we asked ourselves, why not build this for India? Why not build a platform where any Indian living in India who needs assistance of any form, financial assistance of any form or kind, is able to get it from another individual sitting anywhere in the world. So that's how we sort of, from day one, we thought of Milaap as, right? Individuals getting support, specifically financial assistance from other individuals. Now, easier said than done, because the moment you sort of build financial transactions, and especially when you want to build something that is global and cross border and so on, a lot of regulations come into picture. And so the first 18 months or so, I think, almost, we started in June 2010. We did like a small event in Singapore, brought my friends, told them these stories of like 10, 15 people, what they need the money for, and we were able to raise the money. Right at that point in time, I thought raising money was the hardest, but it sort of became like probably the easiest amongst all the challenges. We were able to raise like some, I think, $8,000, $10,000 or so on, and then sort of building that regulation, because until then nobody had done it within the context of India,
Yeah.
especially when you want to sort of make it a global. If it were to be just domestic, that was still fine. So we worked with the regulators, who were extremely patient and accommodative, helping us sort of understand what the existing norms were and how an online model could sort of fit in. Took us like almost 18 months, and by September 2011 we were able to sort of get those licenses to sort of build that, ability to bring in that not just domestic but also foreign capital per se. So hindsight, if I were to look at it, we would have probably done it differently, because the way we, sort of built, because, I was fresh out of college, right? So my other founder was also in his mid 20s, so on. I think we were so obsessed with the idea and the sort of our vision for solving that problem, that we, sort of did not take a top down approach about thinking about it, which is essentially saying, hey, how big can this be? What are the regulatory challenges? What are the other sort of challenges that would come in? All these questions around, hey, we're building a marketplace, how are we going to solve for catch 22? None of those were, sort of at the top of our mind at that point in time. All that was like, hey, here's this idea, we want to enable anybody sitting anywhere to sort of help these, sort of small businesses, entrepreneurs, women, etc. How do we make this happen, right? So we were so obsessed in a very bottom up, right? So if I were to advise myself, I would probably, the 35-year-old me now would essentially say, hey, think about the top down, because you are trying to push too many boulders upstream. But I think that's also the benefit of being young and naive, because, you are just, obsessed with one thing and you just want to go and solve for it per se.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I think, being sort of naively optimistic is, it helps you a great deal, because I think if you do all of those market sizing and, you do the typical SWOT analysis, right? I mean, most people kind of talk themselves out of doing it in the first place, I feel,
True.
right?
True.
Yeah.
And to be honest, we sort of figured out our market sizing, in the sense like how big is, like, for example, how big is giving and how big is the space that we are in, etc. Probably 6 years into it, because there was no clear sort of a rational way to sort of measure how, because giving was so unstructured, and especially when we sort of, sort of said it's individual to individual giving, so there were, number of methods that we always used, but every time we never felt confident until, when we realized. So you realize your market sizing once you hit your product market fit, right? Once you realize, oh, this is what the use case, this is
Yeah.
what people use the product for, then you go, deep dive into understanding, hey, how big can this be, right? That's our, at least my learning per se, and it took us like almost like 5 6 years to sort of figure that out.
Right. So reflecting on this experience, right, I have a couple of questions. So my first
Sure.
question is, what are some nuances of managing this two-sided marketplace? What are some tricks of the trade that you have realized?
Yeah. We learned that this is a two-sided marketplace when we opened up the platform in like around late 2014, early 2015. So until then, it was essentially a heavily managed marketplace, if I were to put it that way, in the sense that we used to sort of vet and identify people who needed assistance, and we used to put it out there, and then we used to sort of try to raise money based on the brand name and so on and so forth. And because of the nature of doing that, you could only do it for certain sort of causes, so to speak, right? You could do it for sort of employment generation, vocational training, and stuff like that. In 2014, 2015, we realized that this is limiting, because you're doing all the heavy lifting, and there is no sort of organic sort of growth,
No
right?
network
So every
effects,
time you
basically.
push, you see some growth. You stop pushing, and then it just dips, right? So we told ourselves, why don't we just open up the platform, right?
Mm.
We use the best aspects of why people contribute on Milap. At that point in time, there were around close to 10,000 people who had contributed through the platform, right? Around 4 or 5 years into the existence. We asked, okay, what's the primary reason that people do it? And we realized that they do it because of the trust. They believe that, hey, if it's on Milap, somebody has verified, somebody has vetted it, so my money goes to the right place, right? So we said, okay, while we will continue to sort of keep that as an anchor point, but we will open it up. We will allow people to sort of come and raise money and so on. And when we opened up the platform, we were cause agnostic. We didn't sort of put any conditions as such. We said, hey, as long as it's not political, we are fine. You could use the platform to raise money. And very quickly, we started seeing something interesting, which was people were raising money or setting up fundraisers for critical care treatments, right? Treatments like cancer care, organ transplants, and so on and so forth. And we had no idea about medical until at that point in time. And people were also, those fundraisers were also raising money, so to speak. So we saw that the first thing that we realized was, hey, organically this has a fit, right? There are people who are wanting to raise money, and this resonates with the audience who wants to sort of contribute. Now, how do you sort of scale this? How do you sort of make it more prominent? How do you sort of build it more? And it's a catch 22, which means until you have more donors, people will not come and raise money. Until you have more people raising money, people are not going to come and sort of contribute. And the common theme from both the sides of the marketplace, the common thing which was a binary, which was it's 100% yes or 100% no, was trust, right? Which was essentially, if you solve for the trust, it solves for both the organizer as well as the donor. Of course, from a donor perspective, it's a no brainer, but even from an organizer perspective, hey, I come to this platform to raise money. What if these guys take raise the money and then not give it to me, right? So that trust problem was there. So what we ended up doing was, we sort of worked very closely with doctors and hospitals per se, identified people that who genuinely needed those help, sort of verified it, put it out there, and then sort of kicked in the digital marketing, so to speak, to say, hey, this is trusted, this is where the person is, never before seen kind of stuff, like these are the hospital documents and so on and so forth, and this is the contact way to sort of directly contact, and etc. And that sort of brought in donors to contribute, and ensured that that loop sort of gets completed in 30 to 60 days, in terms of the feedback loop. Like I said, what we are selling is an intangible, which is essentially trust and satisfaction.
Yeah.
So ensuring that people get those updates within 30 days as to what has happened with the money, how is the person doing, and so on. And this slowly sort of kicked in the organic flywheel, which was, so basically we seeded one side of the marketplace, which was essentially, we identified, vetted people who required money for their treatments. We knew for sure that they are going to get treated in so and so hospitals. We knew that the money was going directly to the hospitals. We knew that these were patients where the probability of success, right, which is also an important metric, people may not sort of explicitly say, but success of that treatment is an important sort of a factor. So we looked at those and then sort of put it out there, and then ensured, and one led to another. We pumped in digital marketing. We saw people were contributing, but conversions were poor. we started doing research as to why, and then we realized, hey, people did not resonate with the content. Okay, so then we said, okay, we'll have to sort of interview these folks, write their actual stories, etc. So, take pictures and so on and so forth. And then essentially saw that, some of these conversion rates sort of improving. And then again, questions were there. Yeah, I'm not sure whether this person actually exists, etc. So then, go out there, do videos and so on. So one layer after layer over a period of time. But the fundamental piece was you seed one side of the marketplace, and then you sort of drive in traffic from the other side, keeping in mind what is that common thing which is a 100% yes or a no. For us, we discovered that the 100% yes or no was trust. So, we focus primarily on that to sort of build the flywheel.
Yeah, very interesting lesson actually. I mean, to think about it, because what you saw was a certain characteristic, right? And you kind of verticalized to support that characteristic, right? In this case, you tied up with hospitals and doctors and started focusing a little more on that whole medical care and everything. And it kind of makes sense, I guess. I mean, there are so many statistics that show that out-of-pocket expenses are perhaps the biggest expenses that families in India bear. And there's just so many families that are just maybe one expense short of falling into poverty, right? So yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, I think.
That's something that we learned when I said, I told her some time back about market sizing. That's when we learned about how big was this, right? And we realized that every year in India, roughly around out of pocket around $70 billion, 70 to $80 billion is essentially paid out of pocket for healthcare expenditure. This is non-insurance, non-government sort of schemes per se. Of course, savings is probably the biggest, followed by borrowing, right? And borrowing is mostly informal. But an interesting piece, and this is in the National Family Welfare Survey and Health Survey, was what was called as friends, family, local community. So there is a line which says, classifying the out of pocket expense, and they say close to $4 to $5 billion of
Mhm.
money of healthcare expenditure is essentially funded by friends, family, local community, right? Every year, which is when we realized, hey, we are not sort of creating a new behavior as such. This exists, right?
Right.
When people end up in a critical medical, expenditure, like for example, if somebody is diagnosed of cancer, the treatment cost would be 10 lakhs. Our average insurance is what, 3 lakhs, something around 3 lakhs, 3 to 4 lakhs. That's our average. Where do people go? I mean, they dip into savings, and then they reach out to their closest sort of social network, right? Their friends, family, etc., right? The closest five, closest 10, and so on, right? And they help. What we realized was, yes, we were just bringing that behavior online, and instead of just that 5 or 10 that somebody would reach out to, you're now being able to sort of reach out to sort of hundreds to 500s and thousands of people, so to speak, right? Let's sort of tap into the whole virality and distribution that online provides. So we were in creating a new behavior, but we were essentially bringing an inherent existing giving behavior that has been there for whatever years and decades online. And that's something that we realized after like whatever 5 6 years, so to say.
So the second question I had reflecting on the journey was on the regulation and compliance bit. Right now, if you were to randomly poll entrepreneurs, I think this would be the least favorite thing that anyone wants to indulge in. Right? People either pick sales or product or whatever else. So, what is your advice on dealing with regulation, being proactive on that front? Just some wisdom that you have gathered over the years.
We started our business with being in front of regulators, right, and talking to them and so on. So my experience and my whatever learning has always been that regulation is always better than no regulation, because it provides an opportunity for entrepreneurs to a have clarity so that they could build their businesses around it, and two, most importantly, sort of start a dialogue with the regulators as to say, hey, this is a starting point, but these are all the other sort of issues that might sort of be left in the fringes, and that sort of needs to be taken care of,
Hmm.
as opposed to sort of being in a space where it is not regulated, because you are always sort of uncertain, right? You are always uncertain about what it is. And the worst part of that is also the fact that most people think that, hey, if it is unregulated, you still have an opportunity to sort of shape up the policy in sort of provide your perspective. More often than not, especially if you are a sort of an early stage entrepreneur per se. It doesn't work out that way. You would rather want to be in a space where a regulator has made a step forward and has sort of struck, if not a regulation, at least guidelines, building self-regulatory organizations approach, and so on and so forth. Some step has been taken so that that is your starting point of conversation, and that also allows your sort of business model to be sort of built. So that's our experience, and personally our experience has been extremely positive, simply because, like I said, right, the way we started, it required us to sort of have those conversations with regulators, and as a result of that, we've become very comfortable with that whole sort of process and approach.
Right. What are some other things that have worked on the customer or just the user acquisition front, right? I mean, your ads, as you mentioned, are really compelling, right? It really moves people to action because I think you also mentioned in one of your interviews. I mean, it's not like people wake up and think that, okay, I mean, today I'm going to give, right? Today I'm going to donate to a cause of charity or whatever. People have to be compelled to act, and you seem to be doing a great job of that, right? And showcasing these stories and getting people to donate as such. What are some other things that have worked on the customer acquisition side of things, or user acquisition, I should say?
Yeah. So for us, the way we look at our users, yes, we are two-sided marketplace, which is people who raise money and people who donate. When we looked at acquisition per se, right, while our initial focus was to sort of build that liquidity in the marketplace, right, which is have enough donors, have enough fundraisers, and as a result of it, sort of build that trust, build the processes, and so on. Very quickly we realized that the model has to sort of rely on the organizer side of things, which is essentially, if you give a good compelling experience for the organizer to use the platform, they are probably your biggest brand advocates to go out there and sort of talk about it. So just to give you a split, when we look at our acquisition, we look at both donor acquisition as well as campaign organizer acquisition, as we call it. 2016, 17, the split was almost like 70% of our volumes was essentially coming from sort of stranger audience, which is essentially the paid acquisition efforts that we were putting in, bringing in donors and sort of contributing and so on. Today that's less than 10%. 90% of this is essentially organic. So ads and the stuff that one witnesses, etc., online, that contributes to probably 10% of the overall sort of volumes on donation volumes on a month on month. And
Interesting.
the primary reason was we realized that the biggest sort of word of mouth and direct would essentially come from campaign organizers, and if you can sort of build your reputation with them, that will essentially sort of get others to come on board. So things that we did were ranging from maniacal focus on customer service. So every campaign has a sort of a relationship manager available 24 bar 7. So people might have the smallest of the questions, but they will all be taken care of with the same sort of seriousness, so to say. Ensuring that, we are platform agnostic. So it's not just on Milaap, could also sort of manage the entire process on WhatsApp. You don't even have to necessarily visit the platform, if you may. So we sort of, when WhatsApp for Business came in, we did a lot of automations around that because people felt it much easier, and so on and so forth. So, and then finally, I think a couple of years ago, we sort of said, hey, we charge a fee now. Let's remove that friction around fees. Let's make it 0%, which is essentially we won't say a specific fee as such, right? People can wish to sort of add whatever they want in the form of voluntary tipping, both donors as well as campaign organizers, and that would essentially sort of sustain our operations. What that really did was to sort of remove that friction around raising money on a platform, so to speak, because
Hmm.
the kind of needs for which people raise money, every rupee counts, right? So I'm raising 10 lakhs for cancer treatment, 5% of that is a 50,000 rupees. People might have second thoughts, hey, should I use a platform, should I just do it on their own? But we know for a fact that it's much more efficient, easier, transparent for that particular person to use a platform and do it. And if this were to be a friction, let's remove that friction and let them use the platform, let them raise the money, and then let them determine what do they want to sort of pay us. And the service remains the same, irrespective of whether someone tips or not. So our focus has largely been on organic and word of mouth. But yes, we were able to come there only after a certain, sort of liquidity being built in the marketplace, if I may say so.
Yeah, I think it reinforces that old tenet, right? I mean, the greatest marketing is a happy customer. So it's very interesting. I mean, and you seem to be investing so much, even though I mean you're not charging an upfront fee with these folks, right? So I have a related question. What keeps people coming back to the platform? Let's say as a donor, right? I mean, have you seen that become a sort of a habit where people say X% of my salary goes into donating for causes, and what is the moment of delight for these folks to keep coming back to the platform?
Got it. If you were to look at the first time somebody contributes, they contribute, and I'm talking about the median user. Of course, there are always pockets of users per se, but the median user, right, the 50th percentile, if I were to put it, the median donor, the first time they contribute because they know the person who is in need, or they were asked to contribute by somebody they knew, right? So typical example would be a friend of mine is suffering from cancer. He started a fundraiser on Milaap. It got shared on WhatsApp or Facebook. Hey, I want to contribute, right? Because there's a friend, or a friend of a friend is suffering from cancer, and this particular person whom I trust basically shared it with me, and I just wanted to sort of contribute because hey, I want to help somebody. That's the primary way how people today get introduced to Mila. Not so much sort of focus on the platform or the brand or anything of sorts, more to do with who am I helping. What really matters in that piece is essentially the experience, right? Which is essentially the ease of making that transaction, right? I want to contribute. It should not, sort of have OTP failures and conversion issues and all of those things. That's number one. I should have information handy if I want to look around, right? Nothing should look suspect or out of place and so on and so forth. So really building that trust, building that convenience per se, right? And most people sort of contribute, they really forget about it. The time that they actually sort of build an affinity for the brand, so to speak, is when the feedback loop comes in, which is, let's say, 15 days to 30 days. We make a conscious effort to sort of talk to the fundraiser and get an update as to what's happening. If we have done a transfer of money, we sort of send an update and so on, right? And really pushing it back to the donors who have done it, right? And where they are, right? Whether it's WhatsApp or email. That's when they are like, okay, I contributed to somebody. Oh, and this is what has happened. So what is this platform about? So, and then they come to the platform to check it out, and then slowly sort of look at other fundraisers and so on and so forth, right? So today almost 30 to 35% of our volumes come from repeat donors in a given month. And what brings them back is again the same simple principles, which is essentially around right feedback loop, ensuring a seamless experience, and also in scenarios owning up to issues per se. Sometimes people raise money and that may not be sort of required anymore, in which case we sort of do an auto refunds of sorts and sort of talking about it. So really goes back to the product and customer service aspect that really brings people back to the platform. Very rarely have we seen word of mouth driver as for the from the donor side, right? So when people contribute, they come back to the platform, they contribute and so on, but very rarely they go back out there in the world and say, hey, look what I have done, this is my impact or etc., right? The median user doesn't do it, the organizer does it. The organizer says, yeah, this platform was helpful and they supported me and so on, but the donor does it, right? So driving that word of mouth with donors is a very hard task, right? We try to sort of do the traditional sort of gamifications and
Yeah.
referrals,
I mean,
all that stuff.
I thought that people would probably share this on Twitter or Facebook saying, "Hey, I just donated to this cause or whatever." I mean, I don't see myself doing it, but I thought I thought people will do it.
That's the point, right? People might say, hey, why don't you contribute to this cause? They're more than happy to sort of say, this is a friend, please support. But very rarely would you see somebody saying that, hey, this is the impact of my work, right? People don't, right? Like, I can tell you, like, there are celebrities on the platform, like, who have contributed multiple times, right? And they've never talked about it anywhere, right? They come to the platform every single sort of month and contribute, and they go away, right? They don't talk about it, no mention, etc. Because, and that's that's the behavior, right? So you would rather want to sort of acknowledge that and sort of say, okay, what drives that behavior, as opposed to sort of thinking, here is how I think they should sort of, act or behave, right? Trying to engineer that is a very hard task, because we tried doing and we realized, no, it pisses off people, right? So rather sort of focus on what they want, which is essentially, I gave this money, what happened to it? As long as you keep me updated on it, very glad, right? So that's, keeping it simple has always been the reason why people come platform. Of course, I think it also adds to the fact that media mentions and press and positive testimonials, etc., all add to the trust component per se over a period of time. But the fundamentals remain same: good functioning product, stellar customer service, and building that feedback loop.
Right. What is your advice on building a trusted community? Because, I mean, again, as you've mentioned multiple times in the podcast earlier, that trust is the central tenet, right? I mean, around which your entire business revolves. So for other entrepreneurs who are kind of looking at this and figuring, their own journeys, right? Trying to build communities around their own products or services, what are some 2, 3 ways they can induce trust in the ecosystem and build that tight-knit community?
I think talk about what has sort of worked for us from a from a past experience perspective is one. I think just being authentic to who you are as a founder and what your company's sort of DNA is the most important thing. As opposed to sort of trying to sort of look at examples outside and saying that, hey, these guys have built a trusted community, what are some of the best practices, etc. Because the tonality, your approach towards how you look at the product, the messaging, and so on and so forth is unique to you, and that's what will attract people, and that's what will also sort of not attract certain people per se, right? And trust, community is all about, you share your idea, there are people who resonate with it and they come to you, and you're not so much worried about, hey, why are others not coming? You are only focused on people who are coming to you, right? So finding that voice, and you will find that voice when you are authentic. Like for example, for almost, and I still continue to do, for the longest time, customer service was a function that I headed personally, which was like donors used to sort of receive emails or WhatsApp conversations that I would have whenever there is an escalation, whenever there is a breakdown in service, try to build a SOP, etc., and we go wrong. The first thing that we would do essentially is to acknowledge, yeah, we messed up, and this is essentially sorry from my side. So that's where you would sort of build, and same would happen even in online conversations, right? So people write on Quora. Like I said, trust is central, which also means that there will always sort of be people who would not find this trusted, so the role has to sort of go out there and sort of clarify, and so on and so forth. The first piece to it is to, as a founder, is to sort of find your own voice and sort of put it out there, and there will be people who would sort of come in. And over a period of time, this has to sort of, you would have to sort of streamline it into certain processes that can also sort of percolate into your team, and so on and so forth, right? Again, this building a community is not just about a community manager, right? It's also about how the entire company sort of thinks and
Yeah.
functions per
It's a
se, right?
culture.
Right from your tech, it's a culture, right? You're right. It's about how your tech perceives when a customer grievance comes in, right? Is this something that needs immediate attention to solve, or is this something that goes into my backlog in whatever Trello or Jira, and we will figure out when it comes, etc. So what that's essentially, where the community piece comes in. And not all businesses need to build a community of sorts, right? You don't have to necessarily, I think in some cases, concept of community is overhyped. I've heard like entrepreneurs say that if your business shuts down and if people cry, that means you've built a great business. I find it a bit stretched, right? Like, no, I mean, people might feel a bit whatever, might have fond memories, but people will move on, right? They will all find it. So the important piece essentially is, sometimes your business may not necessarily need a community. In our case, I wouldn't call it exactly a community, but I would essentially call it, because we are in the business of intangible, the customer feedback and addressing that is the core to what we sort of do, right? And as a result of it, we have a strong feedback mechanism. I wouldn't call what we've built as a community, but a strong feedback acknowledgement and a two-way dialogue with users constantly is something that we focus on.
Right. Milap was born right after the financial crisis, right? 2009, 2010-ish. And we're kind of seeing a downturn right now, and people are worried and losing their shit, saying that, X, Y, and Z things will happen and all of that. From your experience of having been through similar circumstances, I would say, in the past, what is your advice to founders on, how they can just keep focusing on their business, tune out the noise, and look at the next 18 months or so? And on that note, what do you have coming up?
Got it. Not so much by choice, but more to do with lack of it. We've always been a business that has been built on strong fundamentals per se, because giving as a concept is not a hot sector or a thesis, so to speak. Like I said, it took us like almost 5, 6 years to sort of figure out what market sizing is, right? And as an entrepreneur, not to say that, we've raised some money close to like 1.5 million when we started out and so on. We've also sort of over a period of time looked at venture capital as an option, etc., and very very quickly realized that irrespective of what the macro thesis, etc., is, our destiny will be controlled by the business fundamentals and nothing else, right? And because of that, right, as a culture, we've essentially, so whenever there has been a boom, it has not necessarily translated into a sort of a boom or whatever. Whenever there has been a downturn as well, there has not been a sort of a impact in broader sense. Of course, we do see some effects of the not just the startup downturn, but the broader, let's say, the economy downturns. When inflation goes up, we do see sort of a tightening of purses here and there, and so on and so forth. So what we've realized over building this business in the last 12, 13 years is to sort of, we built it on the strong business fundamentals, which is being like, I lose my shit if my PNL goes awry in a month, right? Like every single month, my PNL has to be in black, and that's how we've sort of been in the last almost 36 months or so, right? That kind of a sort of a paranoia, of course, it comes with a trade-off of scale, but over a period of time, I've also realized that there is only so much that you can scale or grow, that the market naturally allows you. Everything else is essentially sort of buying with the hope that the market would eventually reach there. Probably one out of 100 times you get lucky, but 99 times you don't, right? So we try to push, like the first 6 years, we've like I said, we raised like 1.5 million way back in 2012, 13, and within 18 months we ran out of money, right? So when we sort of pivoted to the business in 2014, we literally had like a month of cash per se, right? And nobody to sort of really sort of fund, etc., per se, because it's not a thesis, it's not a sector, etc. It's still being for, and to be very honest, it also did not have a product market fit at that time, and so on and so forth. All that we built throughout that journey was essentially just looking at top line, bottom line. Are we in the black? Are we in the blue? Are we in the red? Right? So that kind of culture sort of, again, it's a culture, right? So once you sort of become paranoid about it, then it sort of naturally percolates to every member in the team, right? So it's not a switch, right, where you can say grow, 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 and suddenly then you reserve, you say, okay, now we are just going to focus on profitability. It doesn't happen overnight. Like for us to make that shift, it took us almost a year to sort of get into that zone where everybody starts thinking about it. It just cannot be the CEO or the founder thinking about, we have to be cost efficient. Every single member, right? Like your CTO has to think about, hey, this is what costs me in my server expenses and in these tools. Are there cheaper open source options available? And what are the trade-offs that we have to make? And that mindset is a culture. You have to keep hammering it, right? And you can keep it hammering only when you are consistent with that thought. So for us, it has been that. So for entrepreneurs currently sort of being paranoid about it, I think if the focus is on fundamentals, number one, where if you believe that you are in the for the long term, you want to build a business for 7, 10 years and so on, right, and build value along the way, I don't think there is much to sort of worry about, right? With being conscious about the trade-off that you're making, which is essentially you will grow at the pace at which the market will grow, right? And varies from, for us it was like we grew like 40, 50% year on year, per se. And then COVID tailwinds really sort of took off for those 2 years. And again, now, sort of growing again organically per se. So if you make peace with that, and if you start building this as a culture, the fundamental tenet of a business is to create value. And as a result of it, be profitable, then I don't think there is a much of a worry per se. That's my advice. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's great advice actually. I mean, I think there's precious little that anyone can do about externalities, right? I mean, whether it's
Yeah.
the market or whether it's whatever happened with COVID and so on. It's really the day-to-day stuff that is in the control of founders and operators and so on. I kind of liken it to borrowing from the market, right? I mean, if you have borrowed your growth from the market, then I mean you're dependent on the market in some sense. Whereas I mean, if you are focused on value creation and focused on your customer as such, then you should just continue to focus on that. And the next 18-20 months will be different. It won't be the same, but I mean, it'll, you'll still have to do the same things, right, with a greater focus, I suppose, right? So
I think it's hard. I mean, yes, while it makes complete sense, it's hard because there is so much noise around grow at all costs, capture the market, winner takes
yeah,
it all, blitz
yeah,
scaling, and so on. So it's very hard as an entrepreneur. So it's not like, I sometimes envy entrepreneurs who are bootstrapped, right? Like to have
mm,
that kind of clarity from day one to sort of build that business as I did, right? For the longest time, we said VC funded way is for us the way per se. But once for us, it was a lack of choice. We said, okay, it's not a hot sector. You cannot buy growth in this. So you grow as much as what the market allows you to grow, build your customer service, etc. So it is hard, right? But
right.
yes, maybe this is probably the start of businesses which start thinking along those lines per se. So I think entrepreneurs who are starting now, or who have just started in the last few months, are probably at a greater advantage because it allows you to shape your culture than sort of people who have been in the sort of buying the growth sort of wave, so to say.
Yeah, that's a great point. And before we end the podcast, any books or podcasts or resources that you would recommend to our listeners?
So the podcast, like I said, I listen to yours. Apart from that, the one other one that I really love listening to is Rework by the Basecamp folks. Really gives a contrarian view to everything that happens in the startup world. So that's the podcast that I listen to. In terms of the books, the ones that I'm more of an audiobooks guy, right? Most of the time doing my chores than a reader. I think the one that I recently read, which was very interesting, was a book called "This Can Be Your Future." This was written by Yancey Strickler, who's the co-founder of Kickstarter, and he proposes a new sort of model, which is essentially called as the stakeholder capitalism, which is how can you sort of make your customers, your employees, your users part of the overall, the capitalism, right? The shareholding and the wealth creation and the distribution process. And goes back, he talks about how it has been there for centuries in the form of cooperatives and so on, and how this could apply specifically for the digital world. So that's a very interesting book that I listened to. The other one that I'm now listening to is The Cancer Code by Dr. Jason Fung. He essentially sort of breaks down the genesis of cancer and also sort of talks about how there's a lot of focus on genetics and so on, but not so much about lifestyle and how lifestyle can sort of influence the probability of it. But pretty interesting anecdotes and so on. So yeah, those are the two sort of
Yeah.
recent books. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, Jason Fung, for sure. I mean, I've read parts
Yeah.
of the diabetes code, right? And
Exactly.
so I'm big on intermittent
He
fasting
makes
as well. So,
references to that. In fact, he makes references to
right.
how your risk of diabetes directly correlates with your risk of cancer and so on. So very, very fascinating.
Yeah. Very interesting. Hey, thanks so much, Anoj, for being on the podcast. This was a fantastic conversation. I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Roshan. Thanks for having me here. Cheers.
Before you leave, don't forget to like this episode and rate and review us on your favorite podcast platforms. It helps more people discover our content. We produce a couple of episodes every week and a startup operator roundup on the weekends. Again, all valuable content. Please share these with your fellow startup operators. Follow us on social media and subscribe to our WhatsApp newsletter so you can get all of this content delivered straight to your inbox. I'll see you again on another episode.